to me, I'm sure I was being unjust, pointless, that I really gave up. And I thought, well, you know what? I would think I was a senior by then. I don't really care if I do that well in the course, and I'll just go to the lectures and, take the midterm and the final based on the lectures. Shep, being a serious prospective academic, I think did actually do the readings, but it turned out, luckily, if you memorized the lectures, you could do fine on the exams. So, I mean, Jim was politely assigning the classics of public administration as readings, but didn't actually, and was always extremely, in class, I would say, polite about his predecessor's work. But the gap, I mean, I would say I've almost never seen anything like this. The gap between the quality of his work and the quality of the field that he was working in was really obvious and astonishing, even to a 20-year-old undergraduate. But it's good that you did the readings. And you can't say, Shep can't say he didn't do the readings because he would be as a major figure in political science.
But Bill is right about that.
Comments on some of the themes that?
I have one question. One of the essays that Jim sent me before he died was a draft manuscript, actually, of Thea Skocpol's new book on the Tea Party. Mm-hmm. And though I haven't read it yet, I've looked at some of the essays that she's written about it, and he would probably put the Tea Party, and I guess this is my question, into the amateur camp.
Right, yeah, I think you'd view that as a really a particularly good example of the amateur spirit. When you think about the things that he said were crucial, one is the emphasis above all on policy results, on participation, responsiveness to politicians, to grassroots organizations. So it really is quite remarkable that what he said in 1960 about amateur liberal clubs in New York City applies so well to the Tea Party today.
Shep, one of the striking things about the difference between what he was doing and what was done before him in public administration is that he refused to participate in either of the main schools that you might say the field consisted of. He didn't look at institutional structure exactly, and he didn't look at individual psychology exactly. Mm-hmm. We would say today he was part of the culture school, but really he was the culture school. And from right on, early from his first works on bureaucracy, you see him striving to explain human behavior as a function of the culture in which we exist. The idea of institutional culture, which is so natural to those of us studying political science so many years later, is really novel in his kind of writing about bureaucratic institutions. Where did it come? Is it in fact novel, and if so, where could it have come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think throughout his work, you see this. He started at a relatively conventional point, although influenced by Ed Banfield, which helps you be unconventional, about looking at individual motives. And he drifted over his career to be much more interested in culture and in also in individual psychology. And you see that in his work in bureaucracy. That starts off, he's interested in incentives, and increasingly it goes to organizational culture. And you see this in his work on crime. He's interested originally in trying to create incentives that will lead to less crime, and by the end of his career, he's really interested in how culture affected people's propensity to engage in crime. That's really what Broken Windows is about. What is the collective culture surrounding people? And I think what I would say is, this sounds very naive, I suppose, but it was just the power of observation. He would study relentlessly various organizations, and he would look at ones that were highly successful. He had an inside look at the FBI. He studied the Social Security Administration, police departments. And what he found was that this organizational culture and the way in which organizations, I guess I'd stress it, the way organizations influence people's understanding of what they're doing really was one of the most important changes in his understanding of bureaucracy, and I think in the entire field.
Another way of saying that maybe would be that it seems to me that Jim understood very early the importance of incentives, both individual and small group incentives within a bureaucracy, which was a bit of a break from a sort of naive public administration, that didn't think through what the actual real incentives of these different players were, as opposed to sort of the nominal goals of everyone working together simply to further the goals, the policy goals of the agency. But his understanding of incentives, as you suggested, was broader than the sort of typical economists or economics understanding of
It's not
incentives.
a public choice.
Right. I mean, public choice was a correction to, a naive kind of political science, but Jim's is a sort of correction of maybe a too excessively simple public choice. You mentioned Ed Banfield, and Chris and I were talking about this. Maybe you could say a word beforehand. I mean, Jim was Ed's student, I think Jim would say, and colleague and co-author. And people had the highest regard for Ed. Jim wrote a wonderful piece when Ed died, actually, in the Weekly Standard, called "The Man Who Knew Too Much," which was his headline, and a very good one. But people forget about Banfield. I mean, his famous books were *The Unheavenly City* and his studies of urban politics. But I think I don't know if it was his first book, but one of his very first books was *The Moral Basis of a Backward Society*, a study of how Southern Italy worked, as I recall. It's been a long time since I looked at that book, but which was all about culture, and how dominant cultural incentives and cultural norms were in explaining that this was not simply, this wasn't sort of a backward society that hadn't yet caught up to a more modern society. It was a society of its own that functioned in different ways. And I wonder how much of an influence, that would have had on Jim from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think Jim were close collaborators and soulmates from the beginning. In a lot of ways, the five of us up here, many people in the audience have been students of Wilson and deeply influenced by his work. But Jim was in turn influenced by an earlier generation, and Ed, who was about not that much older, but an older man, and his mentor at the University of Chicago, had a huge influence on him. Ed was, like Jim, I would say, an earnest liberal do-gooder, who was also very curious and came to the study of politics with an effort to understand the problems in politics and society and come up with solutions. Ed, for his part, had been a protege of Rux Tugwell, one of the leading New Dealers, and worked for him on a couple of big projects organized by the Department of Agriculture during the New Deal. Some efforts to organize agricultural communes, which turned out to be catastrophic failures. And Ed's experience led him to his first book, and a really great unknown book called Government Project. And you can see in that Ed's understanding that the ultimate purpose of politics is to discover means where human beings can cooperate for the greater good, but that they work in a world of, Shep, you used the word variety, and a consistent emphasis of Jim's work is that there is an enormous variety in society. Our behavior is part of cultures, but there are different cultures, and people have sharp conflicts. And that led Ed, and I think Jim, ultimately to the view that the highest political goal is not so much achieving cooperation, but managing conflict. Keeping the minimal purpose of politics is to keep conflict under control. When he wrote The Amateur Democrat in Chicago, which was when he was still a graduate student, I believe, it was published after he got his PhD, but he was there with Banfield, and Banfield was studying machine politics in Chicago. So I think that Jim got interested in machine politics and acquired something of Jim's particular take on these issues. The ruling view was that machines like the Daily Machine were all powerful and they dictated, and business and labor just sort of fell into line and the media did what they said. Professor Dahl at Yale had an important book called Who Governs on the subject, and Ed wrote a book called Political Influence, a great work of political research and thinking that I think affected Jim quite a bit. And he found that even in a city subject to as strong control as Mayor Daley's Chicago, the world was completely different than that which Dahl had described. That in fact, what the boss does is hold back and wait, and you don't make a decision until the unions and the Chamber of Commerce and the public employee, everybody has sort of come to some consensus, and then you move in boldly and ratify that consensus. And I think that Jim, in looking at in political organizations, The Amateur Democrat, Negro Politics, his early books, it really reflects Ed's work. And he became the skeptical, empirical reformer. He had strong views of his own, but when it came to studying politics, he understood that the intellectual at his best is in a separate line of work. He's trying to understand what is happening and provide all concerned with an enlarged understanding of the constraints that they operate under and some idea of little things that they can do to improve matters.
Yeah, let me move to Chris in a minute, but let me ask you one last question. You joked about that James Q. Wilson probably wouldn't be a winner of the James Q. Wilson Award when it's awarded by the Political Science Association in 10 years or maybe in 2 years. But what about his influence in the academy? I'm curious about that. I would say if you walk around Hudson or AEI or Brookings, you will find many, many people acknowledging Jim's influence in many different fields, and certainly in more practical areas of life, police chiefs or thoughtful public administrators. But how much influence has he had among actual political scientists teaching American politics? Is it hard to say?
Well, I'd say that he really played a crucial role in educating a large number of people in our generation. I think his influence has waned largely because of, I'd say, the pathologies of modern social science, the emphasis upon rigorous methodology, quantitative methods, and I think one thing that was really crucial to his work that I think his fear is dying out is actually going out and observing politics. He told a story at one point of how he got involved in studying the police. And he was at I think it's something at the University of Chicago, and he was passing out questionnaires to police officers, getting their opinions on things. And then he thought, I realize I'm going to write about police, and I've never been in a police cruiser. I've never been in a police station. So he went out and he started spending time and having his graduate students spend time working with police and talking with them. And this part of what he did, the richness, the understanding of human variation, I think is fading out in political science and other disciplines. And I think this is something we really need to pay attention to. And I think one of our tasks should be to say, how are we going to renew this tradition that was so important?
You know, this is something that I think Jim was keenly aware of in the last few years. I wanted to share, actually, Jim was very helpful in starting National Affairs and in helping us think about how to approach the academy and how to find writers. And I was looking through some exchanges I'd had with him before we got started, just in the last few days, and found an email. So I'll expose you to a teaching of James Q. Wilson's that you probably haven't read before. After a conversation we had about finding writers and finding academics, a phone conversation, in March of 2009, just a few minutes later, he sent me an email, which I'll read to you. It's very brief, and I don't think there's anything here that he would have minded having read in public. It says, one further point that occurred to me after we spoke that's important in terms of thinking about writers and academics. You should really resist the view of a lot of our friends about the universities. They're not cesspools, they're not dead. There's a lot of great work being done by social scientists today, including young social scientists. But the key to finding them is that they are not generalists. 30 years ago, the best people were generalists. It was almost true that the only good people were generalists. Today, generalists in the academy, especially if they lean right, are likely to be outcasts or eccentrics. There's room for outcasts and eccentrics.
Not that there's anything wrong with
yeah,
being an eccentric.
No one in the room should take offense to this by any means, of course. And he says so. There's room for outcasts and eccentrics, but you can't build your entire stable out of them. The best people are specialists. They know one thing very, very well, but they really do know it, and what they're doing is extremely valuable. You should seek them out. We can whine about what happened to the academy, that it doesn't encourage generalists anymore, but it's just a fact, and men shouldn't whine. So make the most of it. There's a lot of good work being done out there. I think it's telling in a couple of ways. First of all, it's just good advice, and it's true, I think. But it also suggests a couple of things to me about his relationship with the academy. One of which is that he didn't really seek out alternative institutions. Jim really was a kind of, I mean, he was a Harvard professor. He played a major role in the American Political Science Association. He was an establishment figure, and yet was always aware of the limits of what the establishment was doing and was capable of doing, and was always looking for people ideally in the establishment, who were doing things a little differently. But he never, much as he wasn't himself a quantitative political scientist, and you may know better, but just as an observer and a reader of his work, he never really attacked quantitative political science. He actually appreciated it very much and would go out of his way to say that it was valuable, but that it wasn't everything there was to know. And I think it was always an important part of the work that he did, that he knew, as you say, there was great variety out there. There was great value in the variety itself. And as a reader of his work, and I knew Jim mostly as a reader of his work, not at the level that the rest of you did, what is always striking about him as a political scientist is that he had an enormous patience for imprecision that a lot of political scientists today just do not have, cannot stand an imprecise answer which strikes them as incomplete. And Jim, I think, understood that you could only get as precise as the subject would allow. And there were some subjects where the right answer was a very general answer and where that was all there was to work on.
Chris.
I think that Jim has had, his work on bureaucracy and organization has had enduring influence within the bureaucracy itself. I think that a large number of people that work in senior levels of government, especially in the agencies that he studied most closely, the DEA, the FBI, the intelligence establishment. But I find throughout the federal establishment, you find a lot of people who have read bureaucracy. It actually describes truly the world that they inhabit, and it gives them ideas about the constraints and opportunities that they face that goes beyond anything else that they have done. I have a friend who was a senior, very senior official at the EPA during the Bush administration, who took Gov 150 in the late 1970s, after you guys were gone. He was at the Kennedy School at the time. He signed up for the course. The previous summer, he had worked at the EPA, and he'd been assigned to put together an intergovernmental task force to encourage the health, safety, and environmental agencies to cooperate more, to get their different policies in sync. And they came up with something, you know, it wasn't that satisfactory, but it was okay. It was a step forward. And he wrote the press release announcing this new interagency cooperative effort. He got to the exam in Gov 150, and the first question on the exam was the press release that he had written. And it asked the students to evaluate the likelihood that this will actually produce anything positive. And he made a catastrophic decision. He decided to sit down and, instead of criticize it, which he knew that was the professor expected, to write a stirring defense of what the agencies were doing and the fact that they could really make some improvements in increasing their cooperation. He got it back. On this particular question, he got a very poor grade, and Professor Wilson had written at the top, "This student has obviously learned nothing in this course."
On that note, why don't you tell us about regulation?
Well, I'll say a bit about his work on government regulation. It was not a subject of great interest and extended study to Jim. He didn't produce a large body of sustained scholarship as he did in areas of crime and culture and political and government organization. His work essentially consisted of a few essays into public interest in the 1970s, one book which was an edited volume, studies of different regulatory agencies by his students, and a final essay by Jim. And then after that, occasional essays on environmental policy, business regulation. But precisely because it was just a sideline of his, it's all the more impressive what very high quality and durability his brief excursion into this field had. And because it's a very compact body of literature, it's a wonderful microcosm into the manner of his thinking about complicated problems. First of all, he got into this because his getting into it shows that his work was governed by an understanding of what was important in a practical sense. He always worked on subjects that were at the front burner of political debate that seemed to be most consequential at the time, rather than what was going on in the backwaters of the political science journals and were just important to the professionals in the field. He entered regulation in 1972 with a wonderful essay in the public interest called The Dead Hand of Regulation. It was, in truth, a time of great intellectual ferment. There had been this established view about regulation that had existed since the Progressive and New Deal eras, that government regulation was essentially an earnest effort to correct market failures, such as monopoly and externality. So we set up commissions, and they controlled the rates of monopolies, such as power companies, for the benefit of the general public. That view was being demolished in the late 1960s, and there were three directions of demolition. One was Marxists. Gabriel Kolko, an historian, was an example, who wrote an influential book about railroad regulation in the 19th century. And they viewed regulation as simply producer groups using the state to exploit the masses. It was just part of the larger Marxian story. On the other side of the spectrum, from the right, were the economists of the Chicago School, who wished to explain regulation as the result of utility maximizing individuals who work to promote their self-interest in the political marketplace just as they do in the economic marketplace, and got a lot of mileage out of the Mansur-Olson point that in politics, small, compact groups, like a business, an industry association, with very strong interests and low costs of organizing, could use the political process for the opposite of what the traditionalists thought utility regulation was doing, which was to protect themselves against competition and raise prices. So it was simply a result not of any grand Marxian theory, but of profit maximizing individuals operating in the political marketplace. And the third was economists of all persuasions were actually studying regulatory agencies and what they did. And what they found was they regulated lots of markets that were naturally competitive. They weren't monopolistic markets, but they limited entry and created monopolies, and they were actually leading to higher prices rather than lower prices. So the old school was fading away. It was a time of great ferment. But, and if you read this article, it's a wonderful illustration. It will teach, he was a teacher, and it teaches you about this earlier literature, and it augments it with his own studies of issues as diverse as motor carrier regulation of prices, the FCC's efforts to promote decency in public broadcasting. And it's clear that he sees that there's some problem even with these new schools of thinking. Because as he was writing, the federal government was doing things that seemed to conflict sharply with both the Chicago economists and the Marxists. It was creating agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Highway Traffic Safety Commission, that were imposing very heavy costs on narrow organized industries, putatively at least, and in some cases pretty clearly, truly, for the benefit of large masses of unorganized people. You can see at the end that he hasn't quite made up his mind, but we have all these views, and yet regulation seems to be growing in directions that are simply very different from what any of the literature says. His next contribution, he'd made up his mind. And this was his book, The Politics of Regulation, published 8 years later in 1980. And it consists mainly of case studies by students of his. And each essay reads a lot like James Q. Wilson. I mean, they'd studied at his feet, and they'd talked to him, and they were trying to please him. Wonderful studies by people, friends of a lot of ours in this room, of state Public Utility Commissions, the Office of Civil Rights, the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Maritime Commission. Anybody heard of that? The Antitrust Division, and the new environmental protection agencies. At the end, Jim contributes an essay of his own. And he argues that none of the theories that try to have a kind of a grand explanation of patterns of regulation is satisfactory. And he takes particular aim at the Chicago School economists. It's not just that in politics we don't have the metric of money to measure what people are doing and to bargain, but that, well, in economics we take people's tastes and wants as given. Politics is aspirational. A lot of what politics consists of is trying to persuade other people to have different tastes, different wants than they have. It's a persuasive activity, not simply self-interested. And to the extent it is self-interested, it requires coalitions of people with conflicting interests in ways that markets do not. He also points out that the history of the last decade, he's writing in 1980, completely contradicts the views of the Chicago School. We have all of these new agencies that are providing broad benefits at the cost of narrow industries. And in the cases where we've had regulation like transportation regulation, motor carrier regulation, they're actually deregulating it. Politicians such as not just Ronald Reagan, but Jimmy Carter, Ted Kennedy, were abolishing the regulatory agencies that the people of Chicago had said are so locked in and easy to explain that they must go on forever. In typical fashion, he takes the views that are, the theories that are out there, but he sort of takes them down several notches of abstraction to a practical level, and he uses the economist's interest in the costs and the benefits of different regulatory programs, and he comes up with typologies. He loved typologies. They were his way of not just insisting on, but illustrating the sort of variety that exists in politics that theoretically inclined people often want to wash over. Well, you have costs and you have benefits. There can be four categories, therefore, so he had four typologies. One was the traditional Chicago School approach, where the benefits of a program were highly concentrated, the airline industry or the railroads, and or sugar quotas. You've got a narrow group of people that benefit and millions of other people that just pay a little bit more, and so they don't pay any attention to it. That he calls client politics. That is, the regulatory agency has a client, they're working for the client, they're protecting against competition, they're raising prices. But there are three other possibilities. One is where the costs and benefits are both widely dispersed. Antitrust policy, advertising regulation. There's no one industry that pays for it. You never know in advance where the policies are going to come to rest. They're not things that people pay too much attention to, either on the cost or benefit side. You have what he called majoritarian politics. There are also cases where the costs are narrow and the benefits are narrow. Labor union politics, the Federal Maritime Commission, nobody cares about it except the shippers and their customers. And you get very different patterns of politics than the Chicagoans were trying to describe. And finally, the newest form, where you have benefits that are widely dispersed and the costs which are concentrated. There you have entrepreneurial politics that give rise to such as the EPA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Commission, where in distinction to all of the three other forms, politics is very driven by publicity, by media, by crisis mongering, to attempt to gather as many people from the broad majority into the support of the program. And here, because of the changes in American politics that were making access to politics, access to the bureaucracy, much much easier. The costs of political organization were falling. Here again, he's using Mansur Olson, George Stigler, but applying them more widely. There's much more opportunity for entrepreneurial politics than we had ever seen before. In this work, I want to say two other things about it. You can see his work that he's doing that is going to give form to his work on the bureaucracy in the book Bureaucracy 8 years later. Because unlike the other the broad theorists of regulation, he and his students are actually going into the agencies and finding out what people are actually doing inside the Office of Civil Rights or the Federal Maritime Commission or the Antitrust Division. He's looking at their actual work, and he finds many things that are important in explaining what they do. For example, people tend to regard the regulatory agencies as imperious and powerful agencies that will never let you know quite what they're going to do next. On the inside of the agency, what is most important is you've been given tasks by your political superiors on Capitol Hill that are essentially impossible. At EPA, they're supposed to categorize and regulate tens of thousands of chemicals. Well, it would take a couple of years to figure out what to do about a dozen of them. They could never possibly get hold of their workload. And the key behavioral incentive is risk aversion. If you are at a regulatory agency, a outbreak of cancer as a side effect of a drug that you have approved, or pesticides causing birth defects, you want above all to prevent that happening. The problem that people ascribe to regulation is more often the result of timidity, risk aversion, protection of bureaucratic turf than in imperiousness or anti-corporate attitudes on the behalf of the agencies. He obviously thinks well of the Chicago School economists' studies of the ineffectiveness or perversity of regulation. He's obviously been very dissatisfied with what they have at their attempt to explain patterns of regulation. He thinks things are much more complex, and he is satisfied with a much lower level of theory that he believes is truer to the facts. And what he finds is something surprising, that the amazing thing about the bureaucracy is how autonomous it is. It's not so much controlled by the shippers or the Sierra Club. They have an enormous amount of discretion in what they do. Presidents often nominate heads of commissions with very, very little attention as compared to, if you compare the power of the agencies to the power of the spending and the Treasury Department and so forth. They're pretty much on their own. And from within that world, the role of ideas such as what is good and bad in regulation play an outsized role, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. And he says in conclusion, where he draws all of this together, in particular his criticism of the Chicago School, he says, a preoccupation with the political role of material interests, while useful under many circumstances, can detract attention from the greater challenges to liberty and economic growth raised by the ideas of those groups in our society, bureaucrats, professionals, academics, the media, whose political position depends on controlling resources other than wealth and whose motives are more complex than wealth maximization. A month after the book appeared, George Stigler, the leader of the Chicago School, wrote a fierce critical review of it in the Wall Street Journal. He accused Wilson of losing faith with the true role of the academic, which is to confront reality with a pusillanimous theory that explains as much as you can. And because he wants to see the bureaucracy as simply an agent of economic interests. So it's a black box. We don't really care what goes on inside. We care about the battle in politics between consumer groups and producer groups, paying attention to what happens in the agencies is not important. And he concludes, any book that is satisfied to send people interviewing their way through the regulatory agencies is certain to be a waste of time. 2 years later, George got the Nobel Prize in economics. And I read his section in the Nobel address on regulation as far as George could ever get to a concession statement. In many areas that, where he had pushed economic theory to enormous heights of explanatory power. When he gets to the economics of regulation, title of one of his great articles, he titles the section Acceptance by Necessity. And he says, the explanatory triumphs of the economic theory of regulation have not been overwhelming, and indeed, the theory itself is still relatively primitive. The only reason it is still around is that it takes a theory to beat a theory, and nobody has come up with anything new or better. But Jim, by relaxing the demands of theorizing to a lower level of abstraction, had in fact provided a very true account of what was going on in the politics of regulation. I think that while the economic school has done great work, it continues to do great work today, the typology that Jim came up with of the you might call it varieties of regulatory behavior has been in this one, it was a sideshow for him. In this one area, his typology has been tremendously influential. It has left its impression on the work of everybody who has worked in the field since, and many people who practice in the regulatory agencies.
Thank you, Chris. That was terrific. You mentioned varieties of regulatory behavior, playing off Jim's varieties of police behavior. What's the? I'm now blanking. Ed Banfield had a different title for the book. What was?
When Jim had finished his study of police behavior, and he was looking at how the behavior of the people on the front lines, the police officers out on the street, were influenced by different forms of organizing the police department downtown. So Ed Banfield's recommendation was the bureaucrat on the beat. And Jim just, he hated, I mean, he was appalled. First of all, he'd spent a lot of time with patrolmen. And it actually was true that he was describing them as bureaucrats, but bureaucrat is a term of opprobrium. He couldn't think of doing such a thing. So he took an old title with a distinguished history and sociology, and he just called it Varieties of Police Behavior.
Yeah, Ed Banfield had been a journalist, I think, at one point, and had a
He had
knack.
been. Yeah, that's
he
right.
had a knack for good titles and headlines. The Unheavenly City being one
Right.
such, and but Jim was being a sober political scientist at that point. Comments on Chris's discussion of?
Just add one thing, which is we talked earlier about the importance of culture, and I think it fits into exactly what Chris was describing about regulation. Because when you go from interest group and clientele politics up to majoritarian and entrepreneurial politics, which was the key shift in the 1970s, how do you explain this? How do you explain the fact that interest group politics seems to have less hold? And I think Jim's argument was that there was an important change in our political culture that allowed these issues to come to the fore, lowered the cost of political organizing. And he, I think, put this forth best in a very short article. I forget where it appeared, but it was called American Politics Then and Now, and AEI has reprinted it. And he has this wonderful term called lowering the legitimacy barrier. And he said that basically when government does more and more, it becomes easier and easier to say that the next thing is legitimate constitutionally and politically for the government to do. And what we saw in the 1970s was a profound change in American political culture that changed what we expected government to be about. And that was why entrepreneurial politics became so powerful.
In the old days, before these changes, It usually took a crisis of some kind. The growth of the FDA was very much driven by a couple of major public health catastrophes. But Jim points out that in the 1970s, air pollution and water pollution, they weren't getting worse, they were getting better. Occupational health and safety, it wasn't getting worse, it was getting better. There were no major catastrophes in highway safety. The reason we got national highway safety regulation was not some splurge in or enormous growth in accidents, but that there was an advocate for highway traffic safety, Ralph Nader, and the General Motors Company had hired a private investigator to do background checks and follow him around and try to dig up some dirt. And that itself was exposed, and it was that scandal that made Nader. So it was a matter of personality, it was a matter of personal politics rather than any crisis on the merits that brought this issue to national attention and that got a lot of people interested in supporting this very sympathetic victim that General Motors had created much to its later discomfort.
We're running a little behind, so maybe Carlin, you can, since we've just segued into culture, why don't you talk briefly about culture and character, and we can discuss all three together.
Thank you, Bill. Both Shep and Chris have been very eloquent in their remarks, but before I begin, I'd like to recommend to all of you, if you haven't read them, Chris DeMuth's essay in the Weekly Standard, a very personal and penetrating essay on James Q. Wilson, and also Shep Melnick's piece in the Forum. This is a very long essay in which he says he just scratches the surface of a very long and extraordinary career, but it's just a wonderful essay that summarizes the high points.
Has Shep's piece been passed out?
I don't know. When James Q. Wilson died, he was the longest-serving individual associated with AEI. He joined our academic advisory board in 1976. I joined a few years later, and I was a very junior assistant at that point, and it took me several years to work up the courage to even say hello to James Q. Wilson, the great political scientist. I had worked for Senator James Buckley from New York, and of course, Jim Wilson had brought his successor and opponent, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, to Harvard and championed his candidacies for the Senate. So with some trepidation that I approached him, but I did, and we began a wonderful friendship that was one of the great blessings of my time, has been one of the great blessings of my time at AEI. One of my special pleasures was in sending him nuggets of survey data, and he almost always responded by writing me back and saying, well, what more is known about this? What other data do you have on that point? And then he would call on other occasions and say, well, what has AEI done on this particular point? What's Brookings done on this particular point, a topic that really interested him overall? And one of those data excursions led to our collaboration on an article for the public interest. He had noticed, and so had I, that in the lead up to the Iraq War, that about 20% of the population opposed going to war under any circumstances. It didn't matter if the UN was on board. It didn't matter if our allies were on board. A fifth of the population just simply opposed going to war. So we decided to see what we could learn about that and look back at experiences from past wars, and we took the data all the way back to World War II, and the responses were remarkably consistent. But I can't tell you how many detours we took in writing that piece, going down one road or another, trying to find, as Jim always did, a captivating and especially interesting detail. But I remember one observation from those excursions that I shared with Jim that particularly interested him. And at the time, I didn't connect it to his thinking about character, but in retrospect, it was the essence of his concern. In looking at the Peace Party, the attitudes of demographic groups remained consistent over time. Black and white men were equally likely, for example, to oppose going to war in Korea and Vietnam. But in 2003, we saw a big change in the data. Black men were much more likely to oppose going to war than white men. I mentioned to Jim the DoD surveys on the propensity of high school students to serve in the military. These surveys are proprietary, but someone who knew the data well told us that willingness to serve decreased significantly for black high school seniors after the film Boys on the Hood and Get on the Bus appeared. In the first, a black actor says that the government's funneling drugs into the black community and the army is no place for a black man. And in the second, the Spike Lee movie, Colin Powell is referred to as an Uncle Tom. Black leadership opinion had moved left, of course, for a long time, and criticism of George Bush was very widespread in the African American community, so those sentiments could have contributed to the changes in attitudes that we were seeing. But the larger point that Jim appreciated here was that public forces, general opinion in the black community, neighborhood expectations were shaping the attitudes of young men about military service. Character formation is not, as Jim said in one of his essays, a wholly private matter. It is shaped by public forces. And as Professor Melnick said in his essay, communities inevitably establish norms. These norms can influence individual preferences, and these preferences affect behavior. James Q. Wilson tells us in his introduction to On Character that, in his words, he was a slow study. He said that he didn't realize that he was interested in the problem of character until the early 1980s, 2 decades after he started writing about crime. He had shied away from the subject, he said, as he wrote in 1975 in Thinking About Crime, because he thought it was futile to get into the area because we didn't know enough about root causes, and that the most likely candidates for such causes, human character and intimate social settings in which it was formed, were probably beyond the reach of public policy. Searching for root causes, he said, only kept us away from the few things that government could do reasonably well. I think there were other reasons, though, that he was apprehensive. Concern about character back then branded one as a conservative, and James Q. always resisted labels. And finally, he was always moderate and modest in his temperament, and I think these qualities made him cautious about tackling a subject as big as character that could be beyond the reach of policy. Although the problem of character was not an explicit concern in his early writings, I think nonetheless it was always there. Reading between the lines, you can see the development of his concern about it in his earliest work. The research that both Chris and Shep have referred to about his early career sitting in police stations and squad cars with police officers, those street-level bureaucrats, to see how they were doing their jobs was really about character. Wilson and his students were watching it in action. The same could be said of his early studies of blacks in city government. You can also see, I think, his underlying concern in many of the public interest essays published long before his 1985 essay, The Rediscovery of Character, Private Virtue and Public Policy. In a 1980 essay summarizing what we knew about criminal rehabilitation that covered waves and waves and hundreds of academic studies, he was pessimistic, concluding that while some policy interventions were having some results in some areas, there were limits to what public policy interventions alone could do. Those studying rehabilitation had to expand their focus, he said, to do more in different kinds of research. But he was also backing into serious discussions of character because the country had come face to face with problems that weren't responding especially well to incentives. What was happening in his thinking about crime was certainly happening in other areas. James Coleman's essay in 1966, of course, told us that family background and community norms mattered more than class size or per pupil spending. Charles Murray's examination of the growing problems relating to welfare dependency, I think, reinforced our views about the limits of public policy interventions without going back to basics. Peter Berger and Richard John Newhouse published their famous essay on the importance of mediating institutions in 1977. And in 1996, AEI, Michael Novak and Bill Shambra brought out an edited volume with the original essays and essays by distinguished social scientists about what had happened since the original essay, delving into many questions of character. But once James Q. overcame his apprehension, he took the same approach that he had to his earlier interest. He seemed to master everything that was known about character in biology, everything that was known about character in family, about character in community. He vacuumed up masses of statistical evidence, and then he found the most salient points from those academic studies. He looked at the problems in a very different way from others, perhaps because he was so immersed in the data. And he provided original insights. As Rudy Giuliani wrote in in an essay in City Journal titled "What New York Owes James Q. Wilson," here I'm quoting Giuliani, "The dominant liberal theories told us that if we provided more social services, crime would get better. But," and here I'm quoting again, "Wilson suggested that instead we turn our attention to providing a better and cleaner place to live, raising the expectations of the community by improving the quality of life, and crime would decline. Broken windows, of course, changed modern policing, and as Giuliani said, the evidence is all around us. While Wilson was realistic about what government could do, he believed that government should focus intensely on things that it could do well. In a typically concise and clear memo to a political campaign, he put it this way: Washington cannot produce fewer teenage unwed mothers, reduce juvenile crime, cut drug abuse, or improve education. These things must be done by intact families, decent neighborhoods, and local government efforts. The great needs of this country are cultural and spiritual. Our great weakness, crime, drug abuse, out-of-wedlock births, arrive out of weaknesses in our culture. That culture must be rebuilt, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Washington can show the way, but it cannot do the work. Here are some examples that he gave about how Washington could show the way. He said that Washington could experiment more with public choice or parental choice programs in education, but then seriously evaluate those efforts using social science methods. He said that the District of Columbia could fund additional programs to create violence-free zones by enlisting gang members, by enlisting people in the communities to monitor their own neighborhoods. He thought that we should work to form what he called second chance homes in which young mothers and their babies could get real adult care and acquire parenting skills while being protected from their exploitive boyfriends. He wanted to create demonstration programs that would make it easier, faster, and cheaper for families to adopt children. So he had many, many specific recommendations that related to the neighborhood and the community and things that government could do. I think that was vintage James Q. Wilson. And I want to close with one poll that I came across this week that I certainly would have shared with James Q. Wilson. This is from the massive Pew study that came out on Monday that highlighted the degree of political polarization in our society, greater than it's ever been before. But there was one question that no one has picked up on in the poll, and it asked people about certain duties that they had as citizens, and 89% agreed that it was our duty to become involved in our community activities and volunteering to address local problems. So perhaps there is a ray of sunshine coming to all of this, certainly from the views of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it does seem to me that one paradox of Jim's work is that when he wrote about very specific policy fields, he was very skeptical often of government being able to improve things much, which was cutting against the consensus, since most people, at least at one time, I think it's still true, who get into different policy fields do so because they think that they want to improve things in that area, and think government often can improve things in that area. On the other hand, when he turned to issues of character, and even the book The Moral Sense, I would say he was less pessimistic than the typical people who write an awful lot about character, who I think are generally perhaps conservative, and there's an awful lot of lamenting about all the damage modern democratic capitalism or modernity in general is doing to character, and the unsurmountable challenges that various aspects of modern life irresistibly pose to, just having a decent country or forming citizens of decent character. So in both cases, it seems to me cut a little bit against the grain, which is probably why he never quite fit in either camp very easily, I suppose. I mean, The Moral Sense is not a pessimistic book, would you say? I mean, isn't that striking? Yeah.
There's always a sense that incremental changes can make a big difference in those issues, where small incremental changes don't make a huge difference in some of the problems that bureaucracies had. They don't get to the fundamental question. But a small incremental change, I always think about the title of the last section of Bureaucracy, where he gets to policy proposals, that any self-respecting political scientist would have called policy proposals, or how to solve the problem. Jim wonderfully titled that chapter, "A Few Modest Suggestions That May Make a Small Difference." It's just the right attitude, but it seems like in questions of character, a small difference can be a big difference in a way that it's not always in public policy.
Yes, he identified these huge problems, and he always looked for those small points of leverage where you could get a relatively simple program that might have a substantial effect, but always recognizing that it's really hard to scale these things up. In some ways, I think he kind of brings us back to a couple of insights of Tocqueville. And one is that while Jim was individual liberty was absolutely crucial to him. But he was also very worried about democratic individualism. Because democratic individualism, he thought, as did Tocqueville, had a way of eating away at family connections and social capital. So I think he was always thinking about how can we tame some of the features of democratic individualism. And I think that was particularly true in his book on the marriage problem, where he says that the problem of the decline of marriage, which is the root of so many of the things we've been talking about, was not just a product of the 1960s. That's kind of a convenient way of looking at it, but it was a part of the Enlightenment. So we really need to do these things to strengthen our innate moral sense that in some ways was being inhibited by some of our beliefs.
I want to say a word about Jim's contrarian nature and about his modesty. It's true that he was a contrarian, but it was an aspect of his curiosity. I headed up a group at Harvard of faculty people studying regulation in the mid-'70s. And I can remember, and it was a pretty conservative group by Harvard standards in the sense that we were pretty skeptical. I mean, Professor Breyer of the law school was part of the group, but he was very critical of regulation. We had this session where we were all talking about our work, and all of us were sort of appalled at what the regulatory agencies were doing and very critical, and we had all of these abolitionist or very aggressive reform proposals. And Jim sat there and he listened to the whole thing, and he had the first question, and he said, can you tell me some areas where the government should be regulating more? Have you thought about that? What are some areas that are under-regulated? And he wasn't just trying to dig us. He wondered if we had thought capaciously enough about the issue. There's a technique in political rhetoric where the writer says, liberals say A, conservatives say B. They're both wrong. The truth is C. And when you hear that, you can be sure that C is just going to be a new variation on A. Always the case. Now, Jim used that formulation, but C was actually something that was new and original. And it was a formulation that took account of the strongest claims of both the liberal and the conservative vision on the case in hand, but elevated the understanding of what was going on to a higher level. It was, in a sense, he was modest and incremental, but I think we have to pay attention to the fact that he was intellectually a very ambitious man. I mean, somebody who would have been led from being a political scientist who's going to try to understand character formation and its relationship to policy. That would have scared away almost anybody. So when he was trying to transcend whatever the particular fray was, for or against the bureaucracy, liberal or conservative views on the role of government, or the political positions of one candidate or another. It's not because he didn't think that those things were important. He thought that his role as an intellectual was to analyze this at some new level and actually make a contribution. And if it turned out the contribution was incremental rather than some sweeping thesis, he could show how much harm had been done by sweeping theses in the past as a predicate for having small suggestions for improvement that actually had some chance of improving the world. So I think that we should understand he was a modest man, he was a man of a very democratic temperament, but he had a very large view of the potential role of intellect and reason in surmounting problems that we have and pointing the way to something better. And the fact that we're all sitting in this room talking about his work and that we're confident people are going to be doing the same thing 50 years from now is an example that his ambition paid off.
It does remind me a little of Tocqueville, who's been mentioned, whom Jim wrote about some, including an essay in the new, very interesting essay in the new Claremont Review of Books, which I guess was a talk he gave that he never prepared for publication, I don't think, but it's a pretty finished talk on Tocqueville and the Federalist, which is quite interesting and I think unconventional in his account of the relation of the two, but and his judgment of each of them. But I mean, Tocqueville himself, came here to study prisons. And and did a little more than that in Democracy in America. And even in Democracy in America, of course, he's sort of, you could assume, and many sociologists over the decades have assumed, well, he's just kind of writing about these things he saw. But when you step back from it, you see a much deeper understanding of the regime and the culture as a whole. And I think Jim would be embarrassed by the comparison to Tocqueville, but nonetheless, there's something of that in Jim's work. He's, I suppose, a little more empirical than Tocqueville, but maybe Tocqueville would have been more like Jim if he had the advantages of modern social science and all the work in the American Political Science Review that he didn't have the blessing of knowing about. But Tocqueville also said, and this is Chris's point, in the introduction to Democracy, Tocqueville says he didn't try to see differently from either of the parties. He's talking about the party of progress in a sense and the party of religion, or let's say the party of conservatism. He didn't try to see differently from them, but further than either. And I think that's very true of Jim. I mean, he respected the participants in politics. He didn't try to simply, as many social scientists do, say, well, all that talk is just nonsense. Here's the right model that will explain everything, and go to a level of theory and a kind of theory that really is not, as you've all suggested, I think paraphrasing Aristotle, without saying you were paraphrasing Aristotle, that you should study each thing at an appropriate level of theory, and certainly that's true of politics. So he didn't try to impose theoretical models, which so many political scientists and social scientists do today, on politics and then think he was explaining politics better. But he did try to see further than the parties who were fighting. And I do think, at best, therefore, like Tocqueville, educated the parties. And I think he has had a real effect in that respect. There is a certain, I mentioned Wisconsin at the beginning and what happened there, but the way in which that debate's just a big political brawl at one level, but there's actually a fairly sophisticated debate underneath that about, well, look, we have a big public sector, it's not going away, no one particularly wants to abolish it. We have ways to, if we want to have people to have retirement arrangements for their retirement, how do we structure that in a way that's sustainable? How do we correct imbalances or perversions, you might say, in the bargaining process that produce outcomes that aren't perhaps sustainable or fair? And I mean, it is striking to me how much many of the current debates among conservative reformers, and to be fair, among some liberal reformers too, are informed by a more sophisticated understanding of the paradoxes and trade-offs and legitimate tensions among different good things one wants to accomplish, as opposed to a more simple kind of, we have the right intentions and the other guys don't. I guess there's a lot of that too, these days too, on the other hand, but I think there's the other side as well. Why don't we take about 15 minutes to have some comments and questions from you? I see there are 2 mics back there. If you can keep your questions short, we'll try to keep whatever we have to say up here short and have some back and forth. Okay, we have a little more. Chris doesn't want to shortchange anyone here, so we have 20 or 25 minutes. I think you have to give people the impression there's less, and then they're happy. Give them hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Right? Who has the mic? I can't really. Okay, so is there a question back there? Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Martin Worcester. I've worked for 8 people in this room.
Is that good or bad? Don't tell us about that, really.
There's a word that hasn't come up in the symposium, and that's California. What influence do you think being from California had on Wilson's thought and writing?
It's a good question. Jim wrote about that himself, and I think many of the tributes to him after he died focused on both his growing up there and his going back there, incredibly shockingly to everyone at Harvard, when he was at the prime of his career, to teach at some school no one had ever heard of in California, UCLA, and then Pepperdine. I mean, that was really that was a statement of its own, I would say, just leaving a named chair at Harvard at the height of his career. But thoughts on California, Chris? Or? Shep, we have no Californians up here.
He wrote this article about Reagan country very early on, which really showed an appreciation of Reagan's support. And I think that his familiarity with Southern California was something that people who grew up in Cambridge, around Cambridge, really just could not understand Reagan at all. So I think that was an important part of it.
I think it played a role in his sense that he understood America. Not in an arrogant way, not in an I get it and you don't, but he came from California at a time when American culture was also coming from California, when middle-class culture was coming out of California. And he always seemed to have a sense that the people around him at the University of Chicago and then at Harvard, they were studying American life in a serious way, but they didn't start out by understanding what it was. And it seems like he had a way of bringing that as a kind of starting point for political science that really informed his sense of what he was up to.
Yeah, the Reagan Country article, which is in commentary, I think in '67, just after Reagan was elected governor of California, is really fantastic. I mean, at a time when no one in the East had a clue as to what this was all about, or at best they thought it was just some, insane thing out of California, that electing some former actor, B actor, to the governorship of California. And he saw so much of what was to be crucial in American politics for the next 15 years and really beyond that in that piece.
I mentioned this in the essay that Carlin mentioned. The article was it's very different from anything else. There's no research in it. He's not summarizing any kind of a literature. It's based on his biography, his boyhood and childhood. And he understood that what people out east thought Reaganism consisted of was completely wrong. And he understood the sociological roots of it. He understood where it was going. He understood that it was he saw economic conservatism and social conservatism. Those are terms that are not in the essay anywhere. But he saw I would say, the ethical grounds of Reaganism in a way that nobody else did. And if you read that article today, it's astounding that in 1967 somebody could lay out political developments that were just going to transform American politics in the next 25 years. And it's set forth there with astounding clarity. It's hard to believe that it was written back then. This was a result of his youth in Long Beach. And so it's clear that in his understanding of American politics and his particular interests, the influence of being a Southern Californian was profound.
Just one word on that essay, which was in commentary, and after Jim died, they made the essays available. I'm not sure.
They're all on the website.
Are they still available for free on the website? Yeah, it's really worth reading, and partly because it's also a very, if I can use this term, neoconservative understanding of Reagan, but avant la lettre, or before the term existed, in the sense that no one on the East Coast or no one on the left really understood Reagan. I think it's fair to say, or not many people did. But actually conservatives, many of his conservative followers thought, well, this is the victory of Goldwater. And this is going to be the beginning of the repeal of the New Deal and a kind of, very tough libertarian individualism. And Jim saw, again, this is early '67, that was not what Reaganism either was going to be about politically or really was about and it was an attempt to curb big government, but it was also a defense of sort of middle-class values and an openness to a modified, kind of welfare state that was friendly to the private sector and friendly to middle-class bourgeois family life, et cetera. I mean, it really is a striking, well worth reading.
I think it was either Atlantic or Harper's that asked him to go back to his high school, and he wrote an essay revisiting an earlier essay that he'd written about growing up and what his high school classes were like. And to me, that was just an extraordinary study in community and how neighborhoods and localities worked. And I think that animated a lot of his less academic work, but certainly the fact that he returned to those subjects later in life.
Bill Galston over here. We can get him a mic. Saw his hand.
Well, first of all, thank you. I mean, this has been one of the most instructive and refreshing panels I've listened to in a very long time. But in reflecting on why it has been so refreshing I'm led to challenge my sparring partner of 20 years, namely Bill Kristol.
I knew it was a mistake to call on Bill.
Because I would like to suggest the following proposition. Abstract theory is to political science as ideology is to politics. That is something that distorts more than it illuminates. And I wish I could agree that I see an outbreak of empirical, skeptical reform either on the right or on the left right now. I think the spirit of contemporary American politics is increasingly ideological and therefore increasingly crude, increasingly given to broad generalizations that obscure what is really going on, what is really needed, or what isn't needed. I think National Affairs is a very honorable exception to that. I think the journal Democracy, on whose editorial board I sit, is an equally honorable, equally honorable exception. And I guess my question is this: is there anything that can be done over time to reinsert the kind of empirical, skeptical analysis of and action in politics that Wilson represented and that this panel has so lovingly described? Because that is not the American politics that I see today. And I see ideological polarization and crude formulations that do nothing to help us out of our problems.
Anyone want to defend ideological polarization or crude? I'll defend the crude formulas, the crude formulations if you defend ideological polarization.
I actually think that there's a kind of answer to this in a lot of Jim's work that tries to connect the study of politics to the practice of policy, which I do think he took to be fairly different things. And he did make the argument, and maybe Sheppy can tell us where exactly, but I don't remember offhand. He did make the argument explicitly that moving to policy is not a direct function of the empirical study of politics, that policy actually has to be guided by a theory. And I don't think he would have said that, I don't think his understanding of theory would have been ideological per se, but that the decision to say this can be solved or addressed in this way because we believe that this will work is always theoretical. It never flows directly from your empirical conclusions that come from a study of an agency or a problem or a portion of society. Information does not lead directly to problem solving. There's always a medium step where you apply some assumptions you have about the kind of society we live in, the kind of thing a human being is, the kind of thing a culture is, so that there is a necessary place for theory and that there is no avoiding a conflict of theories, because those assumptions are always going to draw on differences of opinion that are just inherent to American life about what it is that our society does and doesn't do and shouldn't do. So whatever we might say about the polarization that we see today compared to the past, I do think it's not possible to have an empirical policy debate purely. There's always going to be a place for a sense of what we believe about America to define what we think ought to be done to solve a particular problem.
The only thing I would add is there's been a lot of ideology and a lot of polarization perhaps in the past, and we look back maybe with too much nostalgia at other times. I'm not sure there's more today, but there may be more in the sense that, in the factual sense that the political parties are more distinct from each other than they once were, which is due to a bunch of causes, both cultural and sociological and geographical and others as well. But I'm not sure the population is more polarized or even necessarily the leaders are. But I would just say this, I mean, just taking that Wisconsin example, that, look, if I watched it fairly closely, I think if Scott Walker had not been able to claim, I'll just leave aside merits for a minute, but had not been able to claim with some basis, though, that, hey, we've tried these reforms, they've been going for a year, and in the real world, the Milwaukee Public School District has more money to spend on teachers because they've been able to save money on pensions, and Waukesha does too, et cetera, et cetera. That was a very powerful argument, I think, that helped him get 53 or 54% of the vote in Wisconsin. John Kasich, who put through rather similar changes in Ohio, and they went to the ballot before the changes could be evaluated, got clobbered. There were some other differences too, obviously. But I do think, I'm not saying this was like a huge referendum on the empirical data of each side, but there is a sense in which results matter. That's a very Wilsonian thing, I think. The stimulus was based on a certain kind of understanding of economic theory, obviously. And if we were growing 5 or 6% a year, there would be a big crisis on the right in rethinking conservative economics, because what results do matter. So I think in that respect, there's still a pretty reality-grounded politics here in this country. And it's only on issues where the president has had more success. I mean, maybe some foreign policy issues and the like, the criticism has receded because, if you're killing a ton of al-Qaeda guys and we haven't been attacked, thank God, and things don't look too terrible perhaps around the world, it's harder to sustain a very ideological critique. So I don't know, I think the spirit of Wilson's a little stronger perhaps than Bill does, but we can continue that debate at other times.
What's clear, though, is that Jim was deeply concerned by this polarization that Bill Galston has described. The Tanner lectures he gave at Harvard a few years ago is an example of that. And I said one of the things that it was really important, he hated populism. And because he really thought that you had to have enough insulation in politics to allow the people who are most knowledgeable to discuss matters with each other. And I think he saw that as evaporating, particularly in foreign policy, and that's where he viewed polarization as most detrimental.
Well, which has receded, though, polarization in foreign policy in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, the height of that was really 07, 08, or 03 to 08, let's just say. But that's one of the striking things no one talks about in all this alleged world of polarization, whereas we've got the fewest divisive, I think it's a political science fact, actually, the fewest party divisive votes on foreign or defense policy in the last 2 Congresses in modern history. There's been almost no debate on, Obama lost some Democrats on Afghanistan, and otherwise there's been very little of this sort of 03 to 08 type debates on foreign policy. So in that issue, oddly enough, the system seems to have, come together a little bit, even as we've had pretty bitter debates on domestic policy.
This will sound a little self-congratulatory, but let me refer to think tanks and the Bradley Foundation. Jim, he was involved in some political campaigns. I think he was involved in the Humphrey campaign in '68, early in life. Later on, he spent more and more of his professional life in the world of the think tanks. And well, as his email to Yuval makes clear, he appreciated the virtues of specialization, which the universities had increasingly become organized around, and he saw that that was very valuable. I think he was particularly alert to the importance of these sanctuaries, these think tanks, that in a way are the scholars at think tanks are consumers of the specialized work that's going on in the universities, and try to do what Jim did, which was to extract from all of that learning something that was practical, useful, applicable to the debates of the day. He was very unhappy with the increasingly ideological nature of our politics, and he saw that think tanks, 3 of us are from Carlin, and Yuval and I are from think tanks, and I think that he saw them as as is Bill Galston, is increasingly important as politics becomes more partisan, to have these sanctuaries where people are trying to take, paying attention to the immediate term, but paying attention to the short term, but as far as their own work is concerned, thinking about the medium term.
Next question. In the back over there. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Jim Wilburn. I'm Dean of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine, and wrote a check for Jim the last 15 years.
And he thanks you for it.
I just thought it. By the way, thank you very much. Those of you who knew Jim's work much earlier and much more fully than we did at Pepperdine. The question was raised about California. I was not going to say anything, but because of that, I just thought you might be interested in. I read Jim as as a graduate student at UCLA. Clay LaForce was on my dissertation committee there, and when I quoted John Kenneth Galbraith, he introduced me to a different way of thinking. And so I started reading James Q. Wilson while he was still at Harvard. I didn't really meet him until I was raising money for Pepperdine, and we have something called the Pepperdine Associates, a $1,000 a year gift. And if you're an associate and you live kind of in the shadow of Pepperdine, you can use our swimming pool and our track, and you can see where I'm going here. I was looking over that list of donors one day, and wondering if any of them could be, ratcheted up to a larger gift. And I come across James Q. Wilson, and I asked around. None of our fundraisers knew who he was, so I called him, and we had breakfast, and that's really how I met. Later, when I was dean of the business school and the president said he wanted to start a school of public policy, I tried to talk him out of it, said we don't need that at Pepperdine. And he not only went ahead, but he convinced me to be the inaugural dean. And the only reason I agreed was that I went and had breakfast with James Q. I'd already spent some time with him, discovering he was a neighbor. And I said, if I do this, I want you to design the curriculum. He said, well, I've been trying to reform the curriculum. I spent 20 years trying to do it at Harvard, and I didn't succeed there. But if I can start with a clean sheet, maybe he said it's kind of like trying to move a cemetery to change a curriculum. But, and so we really designed the program with his imprimatur, and I don't have anything to contribute. I can't begin to contribute what those of you who work so closely with him could, except to say that he spoke at a lot of our classes. We used him as a pinch hitter for anything that we were teaching almost. He had done a book or writing about it. And so he spent a lot of time with our students and our faculty, mentored we've got a couple of young faculty for whom he had a tremendous influence that you may hear about in years to come. When I asked him to teach a class, he said, Jim, I'll do anything else you want me to do, but you don't pay enough for me to grade papers. So he and his wife, Roberta, hiked the same trail that my wife and I have as a favorite trail in Malibu, and they became close friends. But he had huge influence over us at Pepperdine. He was, as I think Ed Meese used the phrase for Art Laffer, the supply side people, how they educated Ronald Reagan, that they were leaning on an open door. He was leaning on an open door at Pepperdine. We were ready for James Q. Wilson, and he had a huge impact on the direction of the school. So for whatever it's worth.
Well, thank you. And I mean, Jim loved his early years in California and also his later years in California at both UCLA and Pepperdine. He really loved his house in Malibu, which I think we visited once or twice, and I could see why he did. And I remember asking him at some point, half jokingly, in maybe the late 90s, something about, gee, do you miss, you're having a great time out there at Pepperdine and living in Malibu, and do you miss Harvard? And he looked at me just contemptuously. Like, that is really the stupidest question I've ever heard. Maybe one more. Yes, over here. Yes, sir.
Again, thank you for a very stimulating discussion. I'm Bob Shadler. I had the opportunity of a one-on-one tutorial, I guess, with Ed Banfield for the year he was at Penn. And you've talked a lot about his influence on Wilson and how close they were, the collaborated students, colleagues. Could you point to any daylight or differences between the two of them? You think of them almost as a morphing into a single person in some ways, or at least I did somewhat. But you knew Wilson better, all of you, and I'd be curious if there is any daylight between the two of them, intellectually or otherwise. Not personally, but intellectually.
One difference was that Jim wasn't quite the skeptic that Ed Banfield was, and that he was interested more in finding these points of leverage where you could have an effect on public policy. He really spent a lot of his time being an advisor not a lot of the time, but he was an important advisor to police chiefs, presidents, because he could be counted on, I think, to give some practical advice and not simply be a naysayer. And I think that Ed Banfield was just amazing at tearing down various proposals and theories. He could do so in a withering way. I think Jim then wanted to go a step beyond that.
Yeah, Ed was maybe more radical. I mean, certainly by temperament, radical in the intellectual sense, not in the political sense, maybe, but maybe in the political sense too, in a way. But than Jim, I don't know how much that was temperament and how much that was based on a deeply considered sort of difference of philosophical difference. I mean, I don't think Jim would have written a book. Ed, after The Unheavenly City, as I recall, that in the mid-'70s wrote an article, which I think maybe became a short book, in which he claimed that it was ridiculous that since you could make almost perfect copies of every great painting these days that hung at museums, it was ridiculous to just have one, original painting that everyone had to fly thousands of miles to go see, when you could have in every city really indistinguishable, even to the most expert eyes, and certainly indistinguishable to all of us, copies of the Mona Lisa everywhere, and it would be good for public appreciation of art. And it's just the kind of, precious elitism of the art world that prevents this perfectly sensible thing from happening. I'd say that was more in the spirit of Ed Banfield than Jim. Jim Wilson may have thought that, but I don't think he would have written it. We should probably let people go. Final words up here. What have we not covered that?
There's a lot we probably haven't covered. The career was so extraordinary that we've just, as you said in your essay, scratched the surface.
I'll just say one thing, which is he was just a terrific writer. And I think that's important because he was writing not to political scientists and academics, but he wrote some of his best work for a general, well-educated audience. If I could say one thing I wish academics would do more of, it would be to have that type of audience and to write in a way that is accessible to them.
Yeah, the good news is,
Right.
I mean, the public interest articles, the commentary articles, Weekly Standard articles, a lot of the AEI stuff, all that's available online, which is a very good, you can get more than an introduction to Jim's work on that. One thing I thought of listening to Chris read a little bit from the Regulation book and the mentions of Ed Banfield's old books and Jim Wilson's old books from the 60s, I wonder how many of them are actually in print. And it wouldn't be a ridiculous project, since those I don't think you can probably get. Yeah, maybe you can, or someone should check easily online. It wouldn't be a crazy project for a think tank or a foundation or a university press to reprint some of those books. They, as you suggested, reading, discussing the Amateur Democrat and just thinking about Banfield's books as well, there would be an awful lot of interest there that probably isn't very easily accessible. Now, the joke or the story about curriculum, Jim, when I was a grad student, when Jeff and I were grad students, I guess, Jim, I think, took the lead, didn't he, in revising the introductory American government course in the government department. It was really an excellent course. I mean, it was a little political theory and the founding, certainly, and Tocqueville, but then real studies of real historical epochs and real policy issues in American politics. It was, I guess around the same time he was writing his textbook, so he was thinking about how can you, in one term, try to give people a sense of the complexity and the theory and practice and history and current issues in American politics. That course, I think, is unfortunately not any longer taught the way it was when Jim taught it, and simply sort of reproducing that syllabus, actually, or updating it would be a service to people who wanted to study American politics, it seems to me, on themselves. I think I was a TA, I was a teaching assistant in that course, which was intimidating, having Jim Wilson as the main professor, but we did our best. Chris, I'm sorry, you can say.
There is a website of Ed Banfield's work. It has a bibliography, it has criticisms of his work, and it has the full text of almost everything that he ever wrote.
Illegally, probably.
Well, some of
but
it
who's
is.
to say? Banfield also was radical in that way. He rose above mere law-abidingness when necessary.
There's not even a complete bibliography of Jim's writings yet, but Rand in Santa Monica is beginning to do this. They're putting together a library of all of his work, and I believe, I very much hope that this will become an online resource that will have all of his writings, many of them in full text, and articles going beyond what the public interest and commentary have done. So I think that we'll come to see that pretty soon. In the meantime, Yuval's journal, National Affairs, has an excellent piece by Pietro Nivola, one of Jim's students that will appear in your next issue.
Forthcoming issue in a
It
couple
comes
weeks.
comes out in a few weeks. This piece by Shep is really, really wonderful and quite capacious. Is it online?
Yes.
It is online.
There's this thing called the internet, and it's amazing, really.
But sometimes it's proprietary. It's
I
a
know,
new
I'm
journal.
kidding, I'm kidding.
It's the American Political Science Association Forum.
Right.
And it's called Political Science as a Vocation, borrowing from Weber, an appreciation of the life and work of James Q. Wilson. And it's a tremendous piece of work that Shep's done over the last 2 months.
Thank you all for coming, and thank our fellow panelists.